February is Black History Month in schools all over Ontario and Canada. And what better time to talk to you about anti-racist math? Yes, anti-racist math. It's a thing, and it's going on in schools across the province. I have some fun things to go through with you today, but before you can understand anti-racist math, you have to understand the delivery mechanism by which it is delivered to schools. And that delivery method would be culturally responsive or culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. I have talked about this a few times. There's some other videos that you can go watch about it, but we're going to talk about how that presents itself in everyday lessons. Here I have in my hand a little booklet from one of the teachers' unions, the ETFO, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, sort of describing this particular kind of pedagogy or this method of teaching for educators. So what is culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy? Well, it really comes in three parts. It's supposed to be about delivering high expectations, cultural competence, and critical consciousness, all together in one package. It says, I'll just read a little bit from it. High expectation refers to the ensuring that high academic standards are set for all students. While setting these high expectations, educators understand the importance of differentiation, scaffolding, and using a variety of assessments to support students as they achieve these expectations. Some people in my network have actually asked directors of education, a director of education, how using these pedagogies impact or how they measure the impact on achievement, and they were told that they don't actually measure that. So although it's in the methodology, from my own research as well, I don't see how achievement, which is what they're saying, is measured as impacted by this, or how that works together. So we know that that's not actually being measured. Then we have cultural competence. It involves ensuring students value their own cultures while learning about the cultures of others who may or may not be represented in the classroom. In developing cultural competence, educators honor the social identities of their learning and use their prior knowledge as cultural capital to achieve learning. Sort of. It's not really just about culture or background, race, whatever it sort of seems like it is. It's really about, or at least maybe when it was written, it was about culture, but today it's sort of used to center the marginal, as it were. So in the wheel of oppression that we've all seen is whatever is considered marginal, that's kind of what it is. So it's not just culture, it's also other perceived oppressed identities. So trans, maybe Indigenous or Black. There's a lot of other identities, which I'll go through a little bit in this video. And then the key one, which is critical consciousness. Now, critical consciousness is a term or a concept that was developed by Paulo Freire, who he himself is a Marxist revolutionary. It's not my terms, it's his self-reference. And critical consciousness, it says here in the booklet, is developed when we challenge students to question, analyze, and critique the norms and values that shape society and lead to social inequities for different groups. Ladson-Billing, so the person who came up with CRRP, Ladson-Billing's work argues that learners are given tools to critically evaluate the norms, values and beliefs and worldviews in ways that subvert the status quo. So this is the key, subverting the status quo. So it's giving you a hint here about the type of ideology that is foundational to this pedagogy. Educators teach with this stance as they interrogate and disrupt the materials that are presented to learners. And by doing so, this challenges society's dominant ideals. So they're talking about disrupting and dismantling the hegemony and whatever dominant class. So again, that's another hint really giving you a better understanding of this ideology. It's Marxist in its orientation. It's moved forward from a sort of very systematic Marxism that puts everything in categories and is very dry into a sort of identity-based neo-Marxism or cultural socialism, as Eric Kaufman describes it. And it's sort of changed in its flavor, but it's still using the same dynamics of oppressed oppressor. It's still grievance-based. It's still uses kind of the same idea that it's about disrupting society for the purpose of politics. So critical consciousness, in a way, you could say, it's about teaching learners to read the world politically in regular lessons. And that's the key to CRRP. Teachers really are told that their role today, so when you go to teacher college, their role is about transforming society through their activism in the classroom. And CRRP is heavily pushed right now as a pedagogy to be able to do that, disrupt, dismantle. You'll see this all the time. And this really is this driving force in education. For a long time, this was equity, and that sort of morphed into anti-oppression. So we're now sort of more of an anti-oppression approach, which kind of comes under this equity doctrine. But just last year, a thesis came out from Stephen Reish at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education that looked at the amount of times social justice terms or anti-oppression terms were mentioned within all kinds of documents related to the Ministry of Education in Ontario. And let's just have a little look at a quantitative analysis that was produced. So here he's comparing the number of times that CRRP or critical pedagogy was mentioned within ministry documents compared to the amount of times cognitive science pedagogy or a actual evidence-based pedagogy was mentioned. And the shocking truth here is between 2002 and 2022, so a period of 20 years, there was a 94% decrease in the cognitive science language. As you can see in green, here's the cognitive science. It's barely anything to begin with, but already almost 100% drop, almost just disappeared off the map. While there was a 228% increase in the CRRP language, or the activist pedagogy language, which has no evidence to support it. And the other interesting analysis here was that CRRP-based pedagogy was mentioned or referenced more than 2,000% compared to cognitive-based. So we can honestly say that the methods of education today are almost entirely activist-based with very little actual evidence behind it, actual measurable evidence of impact on learning. So that's really shocking truth to begin with here. As I said, CRRP isn't really simply about race or culture. It can be applied to a variety of different perceived oppressions within this very specific, approved political framework. I'll give you an example here. So this is, they call it the coin model of privilege, but the wheel of oppression is sort of a very similar thing. It's saying that, and this is from the York Region District School Board's Gender Expression Policy document. And it just gives you a flavor of how they view this. So there's this systems of inequality, which may be biases that we're unaware of, and they perpetuate themselves without being disrupted. So if you just leave things as a status quo, you're going to maintain these systems of inequality. And they could be applied to your race or your socioeconomic class, your disability status, your sexuality, your sex, whether you're trans or not. And there's always this opposite here. So it's kind of a zero sum. So if you're a settler, right, if you're not indigenous, then you're not disrupting your settler colonialism, then you're perpetuating the oppression of indigenous people. So it's that simple for them. So there's no real evidence for this, but this is the framework under which it operates. I've tried to do a little bit of research on where the evidence is for this, because if our Ministry of Education is asking schools to do this, then there must be some level of evidence. We keep hearing evidence-based practice, or at least I keep coming across this term, and I'm not actually seeing evidence, but it might be there, and I'm still looking, so we'll see how that turns out. Now, on a side note, the Ministry of Education here in Ontario has asked school boards to do school board-wide climate surveys. So they're asking students questions about their race, about their sexuality, about all kinds of other factors, and then comparing that to other indicators within the board. So it could be grades, it could be the number of days that they're absent, it could be a whole bunch of stuff. And so they're really, what they're trying to do is find what they call disparities. Here is something that I was sent from the Halton Wentworth District School Board. And they're applying what's called disproportionality, which is underpinning this anti-racist, anti-oppressive, DEI, equity, all this stuff, right? So if there are differences between groups, so if you have an average, let's say the average absentee number is 50%, I don't know, we're making it up. And then let's say you find that Black kids are absent on average 55% or 60%, whatever, that's indication of a disparity because it's varying from the norm. There's a delta from the average, but that always indicates an ism of some kind. There's a systemic inequality that is causing this disparity, and it's called disproportionality, or at least that's the term that's being used by the HWDSB. So they do these surveys to find evidence of disparities between groups from the average. And this is what I think is actually justifying this model of education, which isn't based on achievement. They're not actually measuring how this improves student achievement. They're just seeing whether there are differences. Now, they're not investigating any other reasons for those differences. It's always an ism, so they need to do more DEI. So it's a self-perpetuating cycle here. So just to recap, any disparities between groups, any disparities is understood as systemic oppression. And that is what is being used to do more DEI in the classroom. Now, there is a bit of a problem that I have with this is that there's pretty strong evidence that grades in Canada for reading, math, science, so that the skills, right, that are kind of fundamental, are declining quite substantially. So Canada has gone from being a country with very high achievement in these areas to declining quite worryingly compared to other nations. But we kind of know this anyway within the country. It's pretty obvious that students are not learning what they should be learning, and there's a lot more social justice activism within education. So the grades are going down. And there's increasing evidence that some of these diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-oppression, anti-racism, these ideologies, which are based in activism, the Ministry of Education, as far as I can tell, doesn't have any means of measuring whether this is even helping. And again, like I said before, that the disparity must mean that you must apply more DEI. But there's a problem here because more and more evidence is surfacing showing that these ideologies actually create more bigotry. So this study called Instructing Animosity, how DEI pedagogy, which is the kind of stuff that I'm talking about today, produces the hostile attribution bias. Well, what does that mean? This study is basically primed participants with either anti-racist texts. I believe they used Ibram X. Kendi. And then there was a control text, which were excerpts from literature about corn agriculture. So it didn't have any politics in it whatsoever. And the study sort of shows here that those who were primed with anti-racist text displayed increased authoritarian impulses and bigotry towards the outgroup. And this has been found in other studies as well. I'm just using this one as an example. But when actually doing evidence-based inquiry or research on this ideology, on how it affects people, the outcomes are often, from what I can tell from the research, either there's no impact or there can be a negative impact like this study shows here. So why isn't the Ministry of Education actually measuring how this is actually impacting the students? Only disparity equals oppression, so we need to do more of it. Okay, over and over again, we're told that social justice education, anti-oppression education, diversity, equity, and inclusion, all of these sorts of activist pedagogies or ideologies, that they're not really meant to address subject matter achievement. So what do I mean by that? It's not really meant, they're telling us that it's really about well-being and about liberating people from oppression. It's not really about helping them achieve better grades, which is kind of not true because the CRRP methodology that's being pushed says it's supposed to do that. But they tell us that, if you ask educators, well, it's not really meant for that. And yet CRRP methods are designed specifically to be injected within lessons that would normally have nothing to do with activism or social justice. And this is the point of the video today. I want to show you how CRRP, which is the gold standard education pedagogy or methodology, or increasing in popularity in education today and being pushed from the highest levels, is meant as a means of guiding the conversation at hand, whatever it is, geography, math, literacy, doesn't matter, into one about injustice, or at least the injustice as understood within a very specific framework, which is a far left or culturally socialist or neo-Marxist worldview. That is where the conversation gets framed. So in other words, it's a means of training the learner to read the world politically. And the politics is always a far left activist frame. So we're going to look at how this presents itself within math, an area which you would think would not have activism in it. But lo and behold, easy peasy, and let's show you how it's done. Okay, so here we have a document called Culturally Responsive Pedagogy, Co-Creating Rich Math Tasks Through the Lens of Social Justice. So this is just how a document that's kind of going through a bit of what I explained. I think it's a few years old. By the way, I don't think this is just recent. But it goes over what culturally responsive pedagogy is supposed to be. Like here we say social cultural consciousness or critical consciousness, high expectations, desire to make a difference, constructivist approach. This is everything is socially constructed. This is what this is telling us here. Deep knowledge of the students, culturally responsive teaching practices, and so on and so forth. But the really interesting thing about this text from the York Region District School Board is later on down the line, there's some anecdotes from educators here and how they apply it within their classrooms. And I think this gives us a bit of an insight into even the educators doing this do actually understand that they're pushing activism rather than actually teaching. So they're teaching children to read the world politically. Keep that in mind as we go through this. So here we have a grade 8 teacher. And this grade 8 teacher explains within this text, which there'll be a link that you can go read it for yourself, but I'll just run through it. She's explaining that culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy is a method of injecting the ideology, okay? She says that upon returning from a field trip, this teacher spotted what she calls a free meal program with the students. And so this led the teacher to understand this as a so-called teachable moment, which is a term that gets used in education and really means something called a generative theme. Now, a generative theme or a teachable moment is an excuse to bring up otherwise unrelated information. And so in this case, she used it as an opportunity to turn the conversation into how fair it is that some people, or why food banks exist and how kids feel about food banks, and then use it to sort of find statistics and collect data to justify the conclusion of the unfairness of food banks rather than necessarily creating a hypothesis and then falsifying it. But it's as you can see, like there's nothing wrong with talking about food banks. That's not the point. But it's using data and statistics in a generative theme of politics to talk about math. So it's reading the world through a political lens. Math is not supposed to be about activism, or it's not supposed to be about politics, but here's an excuse. We can talk about politics, we can gather data to justify our conclusions about this political view about whether something is fair or unfair. So this is kind of what I'm showing you here. It's about reading the world through a political lens. Now, please go read it for yourself if you want a bit more information on that. But there's some other interesting things in here as well. You have this teacher, primary school teacher in grade 2 doing this as well. So it's not just for older students, it's for all students at all levels. In this instance, the teacher uses CRRP to transform a lesson on measurement. So, kids, when they learn how to do 2 blocks, 4 blocks, and if it's longer or shorter and measure and centimeters and all that. So she's using a grade 2 lesson on measurements to turn that into a discussion about the political implications of the province turning train tracks into a bridge. So it's how to turn a unrelated thing, here measurements, into a political discussions. Here it's about specifically how the province of Ontario did this thing, which apparently is turning some train tracks into a bridge, and then they measure the bridge and so on and so forth, and they can talk about how fair or unjust or whatever this all is. So it's always bringing it back to the political lens. So it's teaching kids everything that you do all the time, how to think about it politically from a far left activist position. That's what CRRP is. Now, why does this even matter? I think it matters because it's downright manipulative. Because if you ask your kid, what did you do in school today? They say, well, we did math. They may or may not tell you that in math, they learn to read the world politically. I mean, the kids are not known for being the most, verbose about what they learn in school that day. So I think this is very, very manipulative, and parents need to understand that this is actually going on. So let's go through another example of in my opinion, which is a very manipulative CRRP methodology here. So this is actually much more recent. So this is another method of injecting ideology into an unrelated lesson, in this case, math. So this is what's called a slow reveal graph. Okay, it's guiding the student to read the world politically. Keep that in mind as we go through it. So every slide within this presentation, so this is photographs taken for me, so I apologize if they're not easy to read, so I'll read it for you. But every slide reveals a little bit more information, okay? Let's go through this presentation. So here you have some percentages and some changes within these percentages, and you're like, okay, and there's a prompt, and every slide there's a prompt, and here the prompt is, what do you notice? Wonder. So we're going to talk about what's going on in this graph, and then we're going to change it. And then there's a bit of extra information here, victims. And the prompt is, what new information do we have? Well, there's victims. Oh, okay, so these percentages are related to victims. What story might someone tell from this graph? So, you're generating conversation about what this might be. We have new information here. So we've got victims. Now we have Indigenous, Black, White, and other. Okay. So what new information do we have now? What do you think the graph is about? How does your story change? Okay, so now do you see how it's kind of manipulating? It's guiding students to seeing the world from a particular perspective. So we have new information now. Okay, so now we have Indigenous used to be 50% and now is 5%, or Black is 9% and down here is 3%. So there's new information. What new information do we have? What do you notice? Wonder. Victims of fatal police action now, percentage of police fatalities. That's the information we have. What new information do we have? What story does this tell? What do you notice? Wonder. So we're guiding them, right? We're guiding them towards what we want them to see. So now we have new information, percentage of Canadian population. So we're going into disparities. There's a disparity between these two. And what conclusion can you make? Okay, so what we're not talking about, so they're guiding to say that there's a disparity, therefore it must be racist. We're not starting, this is the thing, you start with what you want them to see and you guide them to it. What you're not doing is presenting the information and saying, okay, let's think about this critically, let's create a hypothesis, and we'll try to falsify that hypothesis, which is how you should be approaching this if you're thinking critically about it. But it's not, it's activist. So we're guiding into a particular direction, right? So here, there's going to be no discussion about any other factors. It's going to be this disparity doctrine, right? If there's a disparity, then it must be systemic racism. That is the only conclusion that you can come to. And let's find the data to kind of support that. So this is it. I mean, that's just one example of how you can do this. And this, which is, again, the HWDSB, so Halton Wentworth District School Board. And they talk about how this is really useful for kindergarten, how you can do these sorts of things in kindergarten. It's useful for SEL skills. You can do these methods for coding. That's another way of injecting CRRP type methodologies or activist methodologies within an unrelated lesson. Okay, so I'm mentioning this because this isn't fringe. This isn't just a few people deciding that they want to apply this within their classroom. There is a very strong, distinct push to make this the driving force in education. And it's coming from the very top. So let me kind of go through that with you, okay? So it's really important that you understand what activist pedagogy, CRRP, anti-oppression, all of these things are, because this is what education is today. It's not simply teaching skills to students and helping them achieve better grades. Like, that is not the purpose of education. It's transformative, okay? So let me just show you quickly the Ministry of Education. So this will probably apply to most other provinces, although I haven't really looked into it myself, but you should look into it for your own province. Okay, so here we have the chart, the organizational chart of the Ministry of Education. Now, it's hard to see, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit here, okay? Here, let's bring it up. Okay. So here we have the Ministry of Education, and this was 2023. So Stephen Lecce was still the Minister of Education. It's Jill Dunlop now who would be in this position. And as you can see, that's the minister, like that's the person at the top making the decisions. And then under them is their deputy minister, okay? But under that is the Education Equity Secretariat. This is actually really important. At the time it was Pat Case. I believe the position was created by Pat Case for Pat Case, but he's not there anymore. I did a series of videos on Pat Case. Please go watch them. Very, very important. If you're a parent with children in school in Ontario or just in Canada in general, you need to understand how these ministries are actually functioning, because will apply in one way or another to your own province. So the Equity Secretariat is right underneath the minister themselves. And what does the Equity Secretariat do? We'll go over that in a second here. But under that, you have special projects, communication, so all the other areas that you expect education to be, right? So let's have a look. So student achievement division, so how well they're doing. Then you have student support, Indigenous education, early years childcare, capital business, education, labor. So all the other things that have to do with education to one side. So equity's kept very, very separate. And this is no mistake. And there are very few people in that department. I'm not entirely sure there's an awful lot of oversight or checking of what they're doing. So why is this even important? Now, in that two-part series that I produced about Patrick Case, who is at the top as you see there, he started his career decades ago at the Toronto District School Board. He was a communist at that time. He ran on a Communist Party ticket. So that's no secret. And throughout his time at the TDSB has implemented a lot of very questionable programs, done a lot of very questionable things, and it doesn't seem to have stopped him. And in a book from a man called Tim McCaskill, who is a self-proclaimed granddaddy of gay Marxism in Ontario, his term, not mine, wrote a book called Race to Equity, which sort of lays this all out. And that series of videos that I produced really goes over Patrick Case and the history of radical political individuals infiltrating the TDSB. Okay, so you need to go watch that. So when I say to you that education is essentially run at the highest level by far left cultural Marxists who are explicitly turning or using their desire to disrupt, dismantle, transform education in the service of their own extremist political ideology, a far leftist political ideology, I'm not kidding. This is undeniably true. So it's really time for us to start saying no. Now, I'm going to end this video to show you a little clip of Patrick Case himself, person very much at the top here, promoting culturally relevant pedagogy. Okay, so really telling you how important this is. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and debunk some of the lies that he's saying in there, but let's just put it this way, that there's very little evidence supporting what he's saying, and there's a lot of evidence that a lot of this has been massaged. Just take my word for it. It's all going to come out in the wash in the end. But here's a video of Patrick Case telling you at the very highest levels whilst he was in the Equity Secretariat that CRRP was the future of education.
So about just a year and a half ago, we sent out a call to boards wanting to be involved with the Education Equity Secretariat in taking a culturally responsive and relevant pedagogical approach within their boards to classroom practices. And we got quite a number of boards stepped up, and 13 of them were chosen. 13 of them went through the in-service. They went back to their boards. There are now 178 schools doing CRRP work around the province. We're seeking direction to, this year when we sent out the call to boards to be involved, 40 boards stepped up and said they wanted to be involved in this space. And we're seeking direction to conduct in-service over the next few months with 26 of those boards. A year from now, there could be 600 schools involved with doing culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy within the province. That pedagogical approach is a whole school approach to doing human rights. It's not a classroom by classroom approach. It means that the whole school's got to work together to develop an environment in which young people have a voice in the school, in which people's cultures are respected. I don't mean saris and samosas. I mean, in a broader sense, people's cultures are respected and used as part of the teaching methodology in the school. So I would say to educators, get behind this. There's a real excitement on the part of people who are doing CRRP work in their schools. These are mobilized school populations. I'll give you an example. In the school where, sorry, can I just give this one?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So Merrill Matthews is the principal who's working in my office, and he's the guy who's doing the lead stuff on CRRP work. This is the thing that it gives me goosebumps when I think about this, right? In the wake of the Quebec City mosque shooting, right? They've been doing CRRP work in their school for 4 years. In those 4 years, they didn't have one suspension. In those 4 years, their EQAO results went up. The day after, the school day after the Quebec City mosque shooting, the kids and the staff in the schools, there's one teacher in the school who wore a hijab. The kids and the staff in the schools spontaneously threw a ring of empathy around that teacher. That's the goal, people. That's the damned goal. That's the goal. So that's what we want to foster.